So now, I've promised you several times Rachel Copland. I'm delighted to say that following a kind of trial of airports across the UK and Europe, she's finally here to talk to us. So to talk to us about the Trials at Home project and what we've learned about decentralized clinical trials in Europe, ladies and gentlemen, please will you welcome the much-travelled in vain Rachel Copland, Research Fellow at the University of Dundee. And if you don't know where Dundee is, it's famous for its jute, its comics, and a very wonderful new museum. Rachel, over to you.
I finally made it. I left my house 26 hours ago, so I am a little bit tired, but I'm here now to talk to you about what we've learned through the Trials at Home project about decentralized clinical trials in Europe. I'm assuming that this is how I move to the next slide. I've just arrived, so bear with me. Hey. I understand that you may have heard this already this morning, but I want to talk about how within Trials at Home we define a decentralized clinical trial. So it has these three key elements. So trials that make use of digital innovations and other related methodologies to make them more accessible to participants, removing barriers to participation, so for example minimizing or altogether eliminating physical in-person visits, and also allowing participants to engage in more activities from their home. Now, an important note on terminology, you'll find that sometimes people will refer to decentralized clinical trials as virtual trials, as remote trials. It can be a bit difficult to fully understand the scope of the DCT space in Europe because at the moment we are not using the most consistent technology, as we'll see a little bit later on. But just so that you are all on the same page just now, we are using these three individual elements to define what a DCT is. As you can see, over the last few years, there has been an increase in regulatory support for decentralized clinical trials. So on this screen, I've included papers and guidance papers from the MHRA, so that's based in the UK, from EMA as well, but there's also local level guidance. So this includes, I think Switzerland has guidance, Denmark. So you can see that although decentralized trials are maybe a little bit newer to some people, the guidance is catching up. If I could get a show of hands, how many people here have worked with decentralized trials before? Okay, perfect. So how many people, well, I would like to ask you to tell me when you think the first decentralized trial was. I'll give you 3 dates, and if I could just see by a show of hands when you think the first was. So the 3 options I'll give you is 2011, 1997, and 1989. So if I could see a show of hands for 2011. Okay. For 1997. Okay, and for 1989. All right, so a bit of a mix there. What we found within Trials at Home is the first decentralized clinical trial dated back to 1989. So although we are quite tempted to think of decentralized trials as a very novel methodology, it's more appropriate to think of it as less familiar to a wider group. So onto the Trials at Home project, we're looking at reshaping clinical trial designs in Europe. So we'll be piloting a trial and looking at different standards and tools to develop guidance and recommendations for the operationalization of decentralized clinical trials in Europe. We work with a variety of partners, so this includes academic partners, pharmaceutical companies, and also small, medium enterprises. I do have to put in an obligatory disclaimer here that any of the things I discussed today do not necessarily reflect the European Union, or FPA partners, or IMI. So within Trials at Home, we're made up of 6 different work packages. I'm going to focus on the work that we've done in Work Package 1 BEST today, but it's important to know that we have covered decentralized trials from a wide range of activities. So I'll talk about BEST shortly, but we also have a work package that's looking into the different technologies used for decentralized clinical trials. You'll know earlier I mentioned that decentralized clinical trials make use of innovative technologies. I cannot impress upon you enough how important it is to recognize the use of technologies in decentralized clinical trials, and I'll give you some examples of where that becomes really important later. We're also running a pilot study in Work Package 3, so we will be comparing different arms. So we will be looking at a hybrid arm, a traditional arm, and a fully remote arm, and we will compare these to see how a clinical trial can look in these different areas. And we have a regulatory work package as well. I think there's a talk later today about regulatory issues, so I'll be very excited to see that. But this work package is focusing on challenges through ethics and producing guidance, etc. So what we've done in BEST, we have, over the last 3.5 years, conducted a very large literature search to understand the scope of DCTs in Europe. This is where I asked you earlier about where we thought the first decentralized clinical trial came from. And we found within our systematic review that it was in 1989. Now, I know I have mentioned now twice about the use of technologies in clinical trials, and obviously in 1989 the DCT technologies were a little bit different than they are now. But it's still important to recognize that trials that were, for example, mail-based, so using methods such as delivering e-consent through the mail, direct participant shipment of medication, these things all were still existing in the early 80s. So first I will talk to you about what we found in our systematic review of methods used to conduct decentralized clinical trials. We screened a huge amount of data sets to try and understand the scope of the literature. We found 45 publications after a variety of screening methods. So we found in our systematic review 45 different decentralized clinical trials. We were also interested in collecting qualitative data as well as quantitative data, and within our qualitative data, we found 117 different publications. So this could include any publication that discussed challenges, facilitators, barriers, whichever, to decentralized clinical trials. We were interested in a variety of different outcomes, primarily the number of randomized participants, but we also wanted to ascertain other outcomes such as potential participants identified, the recruitment rates, retention rates, cost, and also the different decentralized methods used within the trial. We conducted our searches from the 11th of February to the 31st of March 2020. As I said, we had discovered 45 decentralized clinical trials. 17 of these were partially remote or hybrid, and 28 of these were fully remote. The scope of participants ranged from 10 participants in a decentralized clinical trial to almost 40,000. 3 trials that we have conducted at the University of Dundee have been involving these very large participant sets, so 30,000 participants. We also found that the the decentralized methodologies were suitable across a variety of age groups. I understand it can be, there's a conversation about what age group is appropriate or most appropriate for decentralized clinical trials. We found that actually it was suitable for all age groups. There was a vast array of different age groups of participants, but mostly they were adults, although 30% of the trials that we came across were pediatric. It's important to note that a majority of the trials in our systematic review were actually run from North America or the United Kingdom. 11 of the 45 trials in our systematic review were run from the United Kingdom, which, again, this obviously does encompass Europe. There was another 5 trials run from Europe. So I think it's safe to say that North America does have the lead at the moment in the decentralized clinical trial space. We also found that these different trials included participants from a variety of different countries. So it was not simply to say that a DCT can be run in this country and this country alone. We found that there was DCTs that were across continents. There's many methods for DCTs. We divided this across what we called clinical trial building blocks. The building block is essentially an element that we use to describe the series of activities of a particular stage in the clinical trial landscape. So for example, within setup and design, within engaging your participants, etc. I know that that's probably a little bit difficult to see on the screen there, but some of the methods that we encountered in our systematic review include postals, so that's like what I mentioned earlier about using postal methods way back in the 80s for our participants, using and utilizing telephone, telemedicine, using email as methods of recruitment, for example, apps. So you'll see on this list quite how extensive the use of technology in decentralized clinical trials can be. Also, for example, devices. So a lot of these trials included bring your own devices, which is where participants will bring their own device to the trial. For example, your own smartphone. If I could see, again, by a show of hands, how many people just now have a smartphone or a smartwatch? So that's more or less everybody in the room. So you can see how we can utilize these technologies that our participants may already have to collect data in new ways as well. One of the findings from our systematic review was that there was insufficient evidence to demonstrate a benefit in terms of DCT methods for cost, recruitment, or retention. I know that today we are talking about a lot of the benefits of decentralized clinical trials, and that statement can look a little bit scary. However, I would like to remind you that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Because so many of the trials in our systematic review were ongoing at the time of data collection or at the time of data extraction, we were not able to fully capture the range of an accurate range of these different types of activities. So for example, within the systematic review, within the 45, only 5 trials mentioned cost. You can see that there is a bit of a publication bias within the literature already. It's going to be very difficult for us as trialists to ascertain what the benefit of cost might look like for DCTs, because unfortunately it is just not mentioned. Similarly, we see that many trials, although they will have some information regarding the methodologies used to conduct the trial, will not conduct a formal publication. And as a result of that, we as academics are not able to get a proper and accurate picture of what the DCT space looks like. So I think, as I've mentioned this, I want it to be made clear that there could be more than 45 decentralized clinical trials that we've seen since 1989. Unfortunately, we are limited by the methods of a systematic review. We also wanted to look at different qualitative outcomes in our systematic review. So we were interested to see what facilitators there were to the use of decentralized trials, what barriers were there, advantages and disadvantages, experiences of participants, and other stakeholder opinions. So we had our 45 randomized trials, and we had 117 publications for qualitative data extraction. Although only 45 trials were randomized, there were also some trials in our qualitative review that were not randomized but would still classify as decentralized clinical trials. So there was a lot of very valuable insights throughout the literature. I'll spend a little bit of time on this slide because I think it's very, very important, some of the findings that we had. We found 4 major themes in our systematic review: value, burden, safety, and equity. So for example, with value, decentralized clinical trials potentially offer more generalizable results for our population by removing or eliminating these barriers to participation. For example, they could be physical barriers. Although we may remove these barriers and so participants can take part from potentially all over the world, this doesn't necessarily remove the selection bias in the same way that we might hope it would. So yes, I can remove a physical barrier to participating for one participant. However, the trial design may not actually be appropriate for that participant. And so it's important to recognize that what we add in terms of decentralized methodologies may also have a caveat to that. So in this case, for example, with value, it may not be suitable for that particular target population. Burden. Yes, there is no need to travel to study sites. But if you remove the need to travel to a study site, what then are you adding in? So in this case, we found that people would, for example, supplement the decentralized trial with devices. So how then are you going to respond to participants who have to deal with a number of different devices? The burden removed by not having to travel to study sites could be added back in terms of having to charge multiple devices, having to interact with multiple devices, having to use technologies that both individual participants and potentially even staff are not familiar with. Safety. I asked earlier how many of you have smart technologies such as smartwatches or smartphones, and most of you put up your hands. These devices enable us to collect data on our participants all the time. And so obviously this has applications for collecting real-world evidence, data collected in real time. However, are you able to ensure through the use of devices that your participants fully understand and will be able to adhere to the protocol? Within some of our studies, we found that participants, by removing the physical visit for consenting, they had stated that they went through the trial not fully understanding what was expected of them. If they were unsure how to use a device, for example, or how to fill out a questionnaire, they would ask someone in their family to help them with it. How can research nurses or anyone taking consent then fully understand if the participant knows what they are being asked to consent to? So yes, we can add in passive monitoring through devices, but what are we taking away? With equity, removing all of these barriers to trial participation, fine. But we also want to have a conversation about potential digital exclusion. Although we've seen earlier, many of us have access to smart technologies, it would be inappropriate to assume that the use of technology is ubiquitous across a variety of different populations. The digital divide between participants of a certain age group is very real. Although we have seen within our own trials that older adults can manage technologies, it's also inappropriate to say that this is applicable to all older adults within that category. Within DCTs as well, we are constantly wanting to find new methods of collecting new types of data. So if we do this with technologies, yes, you can provide a device to your participants, but it's important to recognize where other exclusions may apply. So for example, I've mentioned the digital divide, but we also want to talk a little bit about social deprivation here. Not everybody is going to have the same access to technologies that, for example, the likes of you or I might have. Within DCTs, we're wanting to remove barriers. But in doing so, what barriers are we adding? We want to remove physical visits in order to allow a wider subset of the population to take part in trials. But are we only really editing this population to make it easier for people who would already be able to take part in trials? It's really important to understand where these different challenges of decentralized clinical trials come into play. So we want to look at the convenience of at-home participation, but it must be balanced against transferring burden to the study participants. I also want to mention that this is not necessarily just transferring burden to study participants. Not all trial staff, for example, are going to be familiar with the use of certain technologies. Because this is such a dynamic marketplace, there are new technologies available for decentralized trials all the time. We cannot assume that everyone is going to be comfortable with using these technologies. It would be unfair, for example, to tell our participants, we've got these technologies that we want you to use in this trial, and when they need help with the technologies, our staff are not able to use the technology. It's really important that we constantly think about that balance, and that, unfortunately, that balance can be quite difficult to strike. Yes, you may have better generalizable results that are more generalizable to your population, but unfortunately, DCT methodologies will not be suited to all types of research question. Yes, you can remove the barriers of participants having to physically travel to sites, but that might then mean that they have to interact with several technologies. I'm mentioning this a lot because I really want to emphasize just how important it is to understand that by removing a barrier, we may then be adding a new one in that we have not necessarily encountered before. I'll spend quite a lot of time discussing our case studies that we used within Trials at Home. The case studies are a series of decentralized clinical trials from our partner organizations. If you're interested in learning a bit more information about the case studies, I would recommend reading these papers, but I will try and talk through the examples as best as possible just now. Within the University of Dundee, we conducted a scoping review. This scoping review allowed us to identify a series of different potential case studies that we could create for our case study selection. Within trials at home, various partners would propose their own case studies. This gave us 20 different case studies to analyse. We were interested in learning about decentralised clinical trials from a variety of different perspectives. So this could include, for example, what the patient perspective looked like. We wanted to see what specific barriers were in place. The case studies shape our overall recommendations for how one should conduct a decentralised clinical trial. We were interested in looking at the case studies from a variety of different clinical areas, so including engagement of our participants, the setup and design of the case studies or of DCTs as a whole, different metrics such as recruitment and enrollment of participants. The case studies are essentially a look into the DCT space within Europe within the last 10 to 15 years. Most of our case studies came from our FPA partners, but we also had partners that were involved in the consortium, such as academic partners, and we also had case studies from small, medium enterprises, and similarly external partners. So some of these partners were based in the United States. I mentioned earlier how in the United States they were essentially leading the DCT front. We found that our participants in the case studies were able to take part from a variety of different locations. So there were individuals taking part in North America, in Europe, several multi-continent, and also we had a trial that was taking place in India. So this really should demonstrate the scope of how far the reach of DCTs potentially has. Our case studies were also spread across a number of therapeutic areas, including cardiovascular, diabetes, rheumatology, women's health, asthma, rare disease, and neurology. Again, this demonstrates just how vast the reach of DCTs can be. I know I said that DCTs were not necessarily suited to all types of research question. However, we can see that they can be suitable across a variety of different therapeutic areas. Some of our case studies were ongoing at the time of interview, some were completed, and 2 were in setup phase. I think it's important to mention that because it demonstrates that DCTs are not necessarily new in the clinical space. Our interviewees, covered a variety of different stakeholder perspectives. We had clinical trial staff, trial management, technical staff, vendors, and patient representatives. A vendor could look like, for example, a CRO. It could be any external partner that we utilized for a given service. Our interview process included asking participants who had been involved in some kind of type of conduct of decentralized clinical trials what worked well, what were the challenges, how did you tackle them, and so on. It's a fairly standard interviewing process. And we transcribe these interviews verbatim. I'll spend a little bit of time as well on this slide about decentralized trial methods. We found a very big range of decentralized activities within our case studies. So for example, this could look like the use of smartphone apps. So we can use smartphone apps for consenting participants, for collecting different participant-reported outcomes, for example. We can utilize websites as a way of, for example, recruiting participants, as advertising our trials to these participants, and so on. We also have seen developments in electronic case report forms. So, for example, this might look like finding new ways for staff to understand new technologies, for staff that would perhaps remove some of the data entry errors, for example, that comes with manual data entry. I know there's a talk later on about electronic consent, so I won't touch on that too much just now. Other methods that we found within our case studies included home nursing. The home nursing could look like, for example, providing participants with their medications, so infusions. This could also look like the home nurse arriving to consent participants, to collect outcomes from the participants, and so on. We also included telemedicine and utilized local healthcare workers. DCTs are not necessarily strictly looking to remove all visits for participants, physical visits to a site. We can utilize resources in the local community as a way of minimizing these barriers for participants. So for example, this might look like utilizing local laboratories or using remote nursing services within the community as well. Other methodologies included the use of connected devices. So for example, you can use smartwatches to track GPS location, to track steps of your participants, to look at, for example, your heart rate of your participants. We can use devices to see how adherent participants are being, or similarly, we can collect GPS data. We also have methods of looking at social media recruitment and how we can utilize social media to reach a wider range of participants. Many of our case studies as well involve direct participant IMPs, so direct participant shipment of study medications, of study devices, of study materials. This could use courier and postal delivery. I have a question for the audience here. How many of you think there is a standard letterbox size in Europe? Just by a show of hands. So we found, at great expense to our study team, how difficult it could be to create study materials that would be suitable for all letterbox sizes in Europe for our trials. This sounds, obviously everyone in this room knew that there was not a standard letterbox size in Europe, but these are new types of challenges that we are not necessarily familiar with when conducting traditional clinical trials. If you want to ship medication to your participant, for example, these are new kinds of logistics that we have not previously seen. The expense of editing and changing study materials in order to fit through these, for example, these letterboxes, has to be taken into consideration. DCTs, whilst offering many potential benefits, also create new types of challenges. And it is our job as trialists to come up with new ways of thinking about DCTs and how we are all collectively going to get through these different challenges. Some of our case studies utilised healthcare data. So again, by a show of hands, how many people who are working in decentralised trials at the moment utilise healthcare data or routinely collected data? 3. Okay. I'm sure you can understand already that there are huge challenges with doing this. I will provide a bit more of a comprehensive example later, but it's so important to recognise that each of these decentralised trial methods come with many benefits, but may also come with some challenges. Public and patient involvement and participant involvement is a huge topic. We have found that in order for a successful DCT, it must be shaped around the participant. There's a conversation around whether decentralised clinical trials are the same as participant-centred trials. Although I wouldn't comment on that today, I would emphasise quite how important it is to make sure that within DCTs, the participant is the #1 focus of our trial. Back to some of the academic stuff. Within our case studies, we conducted a thematic analysis. We found some key themes for decentralised clinical trials. We were exploring the experiences of conducting and taking part in decentralised trials. Our themes included facilitators and barriers to recruitment, engagement, technology-related challenges and solutions, the transfer of burden, which I discussed earlier when talking about the systematic review, data flow challenges and solutions, and additional challenges caused by COVID-19. What we found from analysis of our case studies was that in order to secure a potential increase in recruitment, better engaged participants, and retaining participants for longer, there were 2 key factors: maximising participant and partner involvement, and simplifying the participant experience and staff workflow to reduce burden. I know that this can look a bit like A plus B equals C, and unfortunately that would be an oversimplification of the process. However, if I can emphasise here that maximising the involvement of participants from the outset of your trial design, so before even writing your protocol, for example, and ensuring that this experience of the participants is going to be as straightforward as possible, this in turn can lead to better recruitment, more engaged participants, and retaining participants in our trials for longer. From that data, we were curious to see, okay, well, if we maximise participant engagement through simplifying the participant journey, what else could potentially feed into engagement, could feed into recruitment, could feed into retention? This is where we conducted a secondary thematic analysis, where we were exploring how interviewees spoke specifically about participant engagement when talking about their decentralised trial experiences. We wanted to understand what interviewees meant by engagement in the context of DCTs. Here, we found 3 key themes: the perceived value of DCT participation, the burden of DCT participation, and trust. The perceived value of DCT participation could look like, does the participant feel that the research question we are asking is relevant to them? It would not be the best situation if we found that we had completed our protocol and we wanted to analyse X number of participants only to find out that they were not at all engaged with the research question. If they cannot relate to the aims of the study, if the participant themselves does not value the research, they are not inclined to take part in our decentralised trials. We also found that participants really valued having feedback throughout the trial. Participants wanted to know about the progress of the trial. They wanted to feel like they were part of the trial. We've had feedback previously in our trials that have been fully remote, that participants have forgotten that they were even taking part in a trial at all. They would be contacted every 6 months for follow-up remotely, so for example by the telephone. We would talk to these participants and say, can you let us know if you've experienced any events over the past several months? Many participants did not know what we were asking them. They did not remember that they had agreed to take part in a trial. And this is because we were not providing enough feedback to the participant. We were not engaging them in the research. And targeted recruitment as well. Those of you that work in traditional or DCTs, do you utilise patient advocacy groups, for example, for your studies? DCTs, because of their slightly different nature compared to traditional trials, we want to involve a variety of different stakeholder groups at the beginning of our trial, and this can look like patient advocacy groups, for example. Targeted recruitment allows participants to feel the value of taking part in their studies. Burden of DCT participation is another major theme that we found from our case studies. If a participant felt that the perceived burden of taking part in the trial was too great, they would become disengaged with the research. For example, this might look like a participant feeling that the use of technologies was too great. There was too many technologies in the trial, and therefore the participant no longer wanted to participate. Because there is such an emphasis on the use of technologies within decentralized clinical trials, it can be very tempting to want to throw several types of technology at our participants. We might want to give them, for example, a study device and a wearable device, and also tell them that they should use their phones, for example, for collecting outcomes. Participants themselves, if they view this to be too challenging, will disengage. They valued simple instructions and simple interfaces. Has anyone heard of the 3-click rule in web development, just by a show of hands? All right, so for those of you that are unfamiliar, the 3-click rule is an unofficial rule in web development that states that if a participant has to click into their website more than 3 times to find the information they are looking for, they will effectively give up. In terms of DCTs, it's important to recognize that we are designing for reluctant users. Our participants do not necessarily want to be on our study websites. They do not necessarily want to be using our various software in order to fill out outcomes, for example. If it becomes too difficult for participants to find exactly what we want from them, they will disengage completely with the trial. Participants want our technologies to be very simple, very straightforward, and very easy to use. Obviously, we want our DCTs to be user-friendly across a variety of different activities, but when it comes to technology, it is so important that it is very, very easy for participants to use. They also valued having choice. For example, if you can provide participants with choice about whether they will use X, Y, Z technology, this would help them to feel that the trial was less burdensome to take part in. And lastly, trust. Trust is another difficult challenge in decentralized clinical trials because you're removing that physical visit with your research nurse, for example. Within consenting procedures, a relationship is built between the nurse and the study participant. If you remove this visit, how will you then build trust with your participants? Especially, for example, in the trial I mentioned earlier, where participants were only hearing from the study team once every 6 months. How can they then trust that research organization? Well, we found that by maintaining regular communication, this was one way to build trust. The way that we can look at the success of decentralized clinical trials would be to look at patient and public involvement. Involving patients and participants constantly in the research will, in theory, increase the motivation for them to want to take part in our research. So this looks like, for example, the relevance of the research question. The participant must feel that the research is of high value to them, to the therapeutic area that we're looking at. They cannot feel that the research is overly burdensome, for example. We have to be very selective about what technologies we want to use. Similarly, we want to make sure that the participant trusts the organizers. They have to trust the study team. We also want to make sure that the trial is relevant, it is easy to take part in, and that we can constantly provide feedback to the participants. So on to some practical insights. Utilizing patient groups, healthcare providers, constant and early feedback with regulatory bodies and data holders can build trust, prevent delays, and facilitate recruitment. In this example, participants valued having personalized touches. And in having personalized material in with their recruitment material, they felt that it helped them to be more engaged with the trial. You want to make sure that you're able to collect this feedback very early on so that you have enough time to make these changes for your study. With routinely collected data, participants can be apprehensive about why you're wanting to use their data. You have to be very clear about why you want to use it. If you're applying for things like record linkage, you have to make sure that you begin your approval process from very early on. Although collecting this type of data is a priority for us, it may not necessarily be a priority for the data owners. You want to make sure that you begin applying for things like record linkage very, very early on, because there could be very long delays. You want to make sure you have adequate resources in place. For example, with new technologies, will you have to bring in new staff? Will you have to bring in programmers, software developers, help desk? If you have a fully remote study, what will you do if your department suddenly becomes a call center? Will you utilize a help desk service, for example? Sorry, I'm aware of time, so I am rushing through a little bit here. Many people will be unfamiliar with the DCT landscape. and it is constantly changing. Many CROs now are pivoting towards the use of DCTs. However, you have to recognize some delays may come as a result of that lack of uniform familiarity. Some vendors will not be as familiar with DCT methods as we might expect. Some vendors, for example, technology vendors, may not be aware of clinical trials at all. They may not be aware of the clinical trial legislation. In this example, the trial utilized 4 different vendors. So a vendor for laboratory testing, for recruiting, they had a digital platform, and they had different RTSM activities as well. This was extremely difficult to coordinate, and unfortunately in this trial, many of the vendors were inexperienced with decentralized technologies. The solution, therefore, is that you have to be sure that you are using experienced DCT vendors. You have to make or prioritize perhaps using full-service CROs. In this example, because the vendor was not familiar with the clinical trial landscape, it caused massive downstream delays. They had to, for example, reprogram many things. This example, the individual did not realize that not all participants will start a clinical trial at the same time on the same day. The regulatory scope of DCTs is really rather large, but you have to understand that if you want to conduct a multi-country DCT, there will be different layers of legislation that you need to look at. Similarly, what is true in one country may not be true in another country. For example, perhaps you want to conduct an e-consent solution in one country, and that is fine. In another country, you may be able to also do e-consent, but e-signatures may not be allowed. It is important that you map legislation for your trials. You have to understand that sometimes medical licensing, telemedicine rules around home nursing, device regulation can vary country to country. I'll just skip through this in the sake of time. Trials at Home Eagle is mapping the regulatory landscape. I would highly recommend looking at this paper if you want to get an understanding of the different technologies and legislation around the use of different technologies and different DCT elements. I would recommend reading this paper. Another example, in this case study, there was a wearable patch device. It was shipped from the US to Europe. And in this trial, there was delays caused because there was a variation at the national level between customs clearances and taxes. This caused delays. I'll emphasize again the importance of a user-focused design, testing new technologies and setups, testing by patients and staff. We must use things like user acceptance testing, dry runs. If you're unfamiliar with how to use a particular technology in your trial, consider conducting a pilot trial or a feasibility study. And be responsive to the feedback that you're collecting from participants. If a participant tells you, I hate wearing this device, take that feedback and edit appropriately as you go. For example, one trial, participants had to wear a device and it flashed through their clothing. Participants did not want to wear this device. We have to be able to respond to that ahead of time. Another trial, they found it was far too ambitious to use so many devices in their trial and that they would have been more successful if they had been more selective. So that is another key point I would like to emphasize. Be very selective about what technologies you want to use in your trial. Be sure that you are very clear around what your roles and responsibilities of your vendors and different stakeholders are, both of your trial staff and of your trial participants. You want to set explicit expectations so that everybody understands fully what is expected of them throughout the scope of the trial. And you must have defined communication procedures. It sounds simple, but one of the largest and most prevalent problems that we found in the trials was a lack of communication. That lack of communication led to massive delays downstream, because unfortunately we would find situations where, let's say a vendor had conducted X activity that was not compatible with the trial. If that communication procedure had been in place from the get-go and these misunderstandings could be reduced, that error would not have taken place. With decentralized trials, you must make sure you have clear communication protocols in place. For example, in this example, the interviewee is talking about how there was a lack of clarity, a lack of understanding. We must be aware of these problems so that we can respond accordingly. Contingency planning is a huge topic. I'm sure you can see many of us were not exactly expecting a pandemic to take place. Within DCTs, these different challenges can arise. For example, if you offer participants a device, for example, a smartphone, what if they don't return that device? How are you then going to process that? How will you deal with that? If you've used a device and the device becomes discontinued, how will you work around that as well? Not all participants are going to have the same access to, for example, the internet. What will you do, for example, if there's a weather event that disrupts the internet usage, for example, of participants? What is next for decentralized clinical trials? Within Trials at Home, we are still interested in collecting information about, for example, social media outreach, home nursing, apps and platforms, and wearable devices. And we've collected additional case studies from our first 20. So we've got case studies looking at respiratory illness, travel-related illness, infectious disease, neurology, rare disease, etc. And our case studies are coming from a variety of different sources. The information that we collect from these case studies will then shape our final recommendations for the best conduct of decentralized clinical trials in Europe. I would end on a single point. It's very tempting to want to add a bunch of new technologies for our trials. It's very tempting to want to test lots of new and exciting and innovative technologies all in one go. I would emphasize that you want to make sure that you are adding technologies for your participants. I would say that you want to be sure that you are testing methods that are suitable for your participants. We want to make sure that we are conducting decentralized clinical trials in order to serve the participants and not the other way around. We want to find we want to find methodologies for the participant and not participants for our DCT methodologies. Sorry I had to go through that so quickly. Please utilize me later on if you have any questions that you don't have time to ask just now. Thank you.
Rachel, that was terrific. Really terrific, because there were so many practical things that you illustrated. And what I think of, ladies and gentlemen, is washing machines. Now, washing machines today come with 30 different programs. We all know that the people who actually do the washing only ever use 3. So the fact that you can do this stuff is not necessarily that you should do it. And I was very taken by what you said about that you've got trials people who are not digitally literate and digital people who are not trials literate. So maybe, and I'm suggesting this, ECRIN, that you might think of running some courses on trials methodology for digital companies. I think that would be a really, really useful thing to do, because they just don't know. I mean, that brilliant thing about they all thought that trial was going to start on the same, everybody was going to start, it was like a race. Fantastic. Questions from you and questions from, there's several questions here, so.
I wanted to ask you about the multinational trials for the decentralized, because you have shown at the beginning, I think, for the literature review, there were 47, you identified 47 trials, of which I think at only 7 were multinational. For the case studies that you showed 20, only 5 were from multinational trials. So I don't know what are your thoughts about where are the main problems to make this type of decentralized trials multinational, if it's drug distribution, if it's the size of the mailbox, as you said, and also taking in consideration this morning Dita already mentioned that there were many particularities per country that they are mentioned in the recommendation paper published by EMA. If all these particularities per country have something to do also with these difficulties to set up these trials as multinational.
Yes, so the decentralized methodologies that we could look at, for example, let's say e-consent or DTP, IMP, so shipment of study drugs. Although the European legislation is the same, the interpretation of this legislation can vary. So one country may allow e-consent, e-signatures, it may allow shipment of IMP to participants' homes, but similarly another European country may not allow this. Because there is inconsistencies in what is allowed by different countries, it's quite operationally challenging to have a study in multiple countries. For example, if you're only allowed to conduct 2 of the 7 DCT methods in one country, and then in another you can do 4, and then in another you can do 7. Because there are these national level differences between the methods that we are allowed to use, it can be very difficult to run a trial in multiple countries because there is so much variation in what legislators and regulators will allow you to do.
Mostly regulatory, because this is, I think, in general, is the main problem that is mentioned for standard clinical trials. It's like the regulatory landscape. Do you think it's the same also for this type of trials?
Yes and no, but because again this is a fast-paced, fast-changing environment, the legislation that we have currently may not necessarily be adapting at the same pace as the DCT landscape. So yes, I think we do need to have more of a conversation at the regulatory level, but for example, the EMA is producing new guidance at the moment.
Let's take a question over there. And can I just make a plea while the microphone is going over there to say that at the end of a trial, please, will you all get in touch with your participants and tell them the outcome of the trial. I cannot tell you how many members of participants in trials I meet who never hear anything again. And it really puts them off, and they tell other people then that experience. It's a real problem. Sir, from Lisbon, I think.
Yes. Hi, hello, thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, just before your talk, we heard a patient that I have to say did not sound like any of my patients in terms of knowledge and awareness of clinical trials. And what I heard, and I fully agree with that perception, is that patients need to be more aware and more participants from the word go. I'm fully on board with that idea. I just found interesting that one of the sentences you used was, don't forget we're dealing with reluctant participants. And I thought, that sounds a bit closer to the kind of patients we have, or at least I have. Now, most of your talk has to do with, and I'm by no means trying to bring it down, but with marketing strategies in order to convince patients to be on board. And this somehow will certainly affect the kind of data and the way, if we have to persuade someone a lot to give us some data, I will have to put that data into perspective. And my question is, with your experience, because there's an elephant in the room, clinical trials use patients, but they are addressed to normal physicians that will actually use the data in clinical trials for treating patients. And the question is, will they trust the data that come from these kind of trials? And that is my question. Do you have any information on that? How do non-research physicians, how do they perceive the data that come from these trials?
So I would say that decentralized clinical trials are looking at making taking part in trials more accessible. Although some of the data that we collect, for example, may deviate from these more traditional methods, the outcomes of the trial are not necessarily different from traditional trials. So I think that in terms of trust, I don't, in my opinion, don't think that there would be much of a difference there, because ultimately if we are, for example, looking to conduct a trial that has home health care, that data's that's not going to change how, for example, drug A affects the participant.
But maybe what part of what you're getting at is that in the past, patients' own collection of data has not been trusted by physicians. In other words, there's been a bit of a paternalistic thing that, you know, patients are not capable of measuring their own blood pressure correctly, or but a lot of things, you know, you've got continuous monitoring, and that's no longer an issue. But is that what you were meaning? And does that still linger, that kind of supposition that once you're a patient, you lose all your faculties and all your intelligence, and you are therefore completely untrustworthy?
Well, I think that one of the benefits of decentralized trials is that we are giving a bit more power and control to the participants. I think there is a bit of that sort of hand-holding approach throughout traditional clinical trials. In conducting trials in this more decentralized, more remote way, you're empowering participants, and empowered participants are engaged participants. So I wouldn't necessarily be able to comment on how physicians will then interpret that data, but I think that we need to understand that, when the participant feels empowered in the research, they're more likely to want to take part again further down the line. I hope that sort of answers your question, but please have a conversation with me later if it doesn't.
A question at the back there.
Yeah, hello. I'm Camilla Tunnel, a pediatrician in Bergen, Norway. I think there are several, thank you so much, it's so important issues here. But I think some of the problem concerning regulation is a definition problem. We had the first decentralized clinical trial with home infusion with 2 kids over 5 years with the Sanofi trial from 2008 to 2013. Have had Fabry disease, which is an orphan disease. There you need home infusions, or you like the States, people are living far away. So in these trials where you need IV every other week, there has been done home infusions for very many years, but they don't be searchable as a decentralized trial, but they have been vital for inclusion of the patients that can have treatment in these trials, because they don't have to travel with a flight every other week. And we've done that in Norway, and many European countries participate, initiated not from the States or UK, but from Israel or Switzerland, 8 trials the last couple couple of years, or ongoing also in 2020. So I think some of it's actually the searchability in the clinicaltrials.gov, and also what is marked in the publications and so on, because it is a lot used. And also in normal, not decentralized trials, we use these apps, and also measuring blood pressure on kids in overactive bladder. It's a lot in use nowadays. So this is an exploding technology, and extremely good, I think, in general, to include more kids and adults with different diseases. So such an important work that you're focusing on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's hear from our online audience. What did you all have to say online? Quick, run.
So I think online we have only two questions, but the question cover so many aspects that I think that we can keep this for the panel discussion.
Okay.
I think they are related to also the data, saying that maybe there are insufficient data to identify all risk associated with decentralized clinical trials. So I think that could be a good topic for the panel. And then also how you use the GP, how you can really compensate also the activity of the GPs, and so I think that we can keep for the panel.
I think that, Rachel, that what I'm seeing coming from you is a handbook. The do's and don'ts of decentralized trials by Rachel Copland.
Not quite, but within Trials at Home, we will be producing a series of recommendations for a combination of best practices for the operationalization of decentralized clinical trials in Europe. So that's going to be a combination of learnings from case studies such as the ones that I went through in my talk just now, and also findings and results from our pilot study. So those results will come around 2024, 2025, so look out for that.
Also, finally, before we go to lunch, another thought is that, I don't know whether it's true in other countries, but I'm pretty sure it is, we all experienced during lockdown all sorts of things that came through our letterbox. You could have subscriptions to flowers in a package that came through your letterbox, or tea or chocolate or whatever you liked. Gin, often that came in a package that came through the letterbox. So there are a lot of other companies and commercial outfits that have real knowledge in this area, that, you know, perhaps a round table with those sort of organizations would help understand what could fit through letterboxes clinical trial wise.
Yes, I would agree with
Perhaps
that comment.
gin might be more might be more appreciated.
Yes, because DCTs are using methods that perhaps we are not used to, we're going to have stakeholders that are not necessarily involved in clinical trials. So for example, technology companies, they don't necessarily know the nuances of the clinical trial landscape, of the clinical trial regulation. Similarly, these logistics companies such as courier services, who could have valuable information regarding the standard letterbox sizes, for example. We want to recognize the new kinds of stakeholders that we have, and leverage our contacts with these vast range of stakeholders. And I think in order, if we are able to do that, we will have more success in the field of DCTs. I think it's very tempting to clinician to talk to clinician, but really this is a hugely multifaceted area with very different stakeholder roles that we perhaps aren't necessarily used to engaging with. So I think a key takeaway would be we need to be having a conversation. That communication is not only important throughout the actual trial, but prior to even planning your trial. Communication is so important in this space.
Perfect segue, Rachel, because it's now time for us here in Warsaw to break for lunch, or maybe if you're online, for you to now break for breakfast, or perhaps supper, or even go to bed for a quick nap before coming back for this afternoon's sessions. So we start again at 1:30 Central European Time. Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you.
To our audience at home, goodbye for now. We'll see you again later. Bye for now.